in matters of faith and morals.
Hi, good afternoon. I want to thank Greg and Family Life International, and particularly Greg, for working to bring me here to London or just outside of London. It's really truly a privilege to be here, and again, I appreciate you taking the time to listen to me, being here today, to listening to me. I wanted to talk obviously about my sister Terri. I don't know how much coverage the case got over here. I'm sure it got a significant amount of media coverage. But I'm not exactly sure what it is or that you know or do not know about my sister's case. So I'd like to talk a little bit about my sister's case, and then really speak to the issue of what I believe is confronting our country. But now speaking in different parts of the world, I'm finding out quickly that this is not just a problem in our country, but also internationally. So again, I'd like to speak at the issue that our family is continuing to fight today, and that is really this euthanasia issue or this quality of life issue. But first I want to start out by just subsequent to my sister's death, our family really got inundated with requests to speak in different parts of the country, and also, and as I said, other parts of the world. And I was never, I was a high school teacher for 8 years. And being asked to speak publicly was something new to me. I was very, very nervous and frightened, and didn't think anybody would want to come out and listen to me speak about what happened in our family and our sister. So what I did in the beginning is I wrote down what I was going to talk about, primarily because I was scared to death, and once I started speaking, I thought I was going to forget everything I was going to say. But I'd like to start out by just reading something that I did write in the very beginning, and I really like it because I believe it's a good introduction for me to start. After more than 12 years of struggles by my family to protect the life of our own, Terri Schiavo, my perfectly healthy sister, died on March 31st of 2005 from the effects of dehydration. The Circuit Court of Pinellas County, Florida, ordered that my beloved sister die this unnatural and gruesome death by commanding that a simple gastric feeding tube be forcibly taken away from her without her consent, and that she be left to deteriorate to death. My sister lived in a neurologically compromised state for reasons that are still unknown, and myself, my younger sister, and my parents wanted nothing from anyone but to be granted the permission to care for her for the span of her natural life. Terri tenaciously fought for her life for more than 13 days of being deprived the most basic, natural, and constant need that you and I all share, the need for nourishment, food, and water. She was deprived of those basic things for one reason only, to cause her unnatural and untimely death. My sister was not terminally ill, not dying, and not succumbing to any killer disease. She was disabled. She was dependent on others. But she was still very much a life, a woman, and a person, in my eyes, my family's eyes, and most importantly, the eyes of God. I was forced to watch my elder sister suffer through the very real and very grisly effects of terminal dehydration. With each passing day, Terri appeared more weakened, thinner, more hectic, and so very frightened. I watched as my family begged for her life, and watched as healthcare professionals turned a deaf ear to her suffering. I listened to the proponents for the so-called right to die coax news audiences into belief that what my sister endured was a gentle, peaceful, and euphoric demise. I sat in the corner of her bed and held her thinning hands, trying so hard to understand that what I was witnessing was actually real. When Terri passed from this world, she took a very tangible piece of me with her. I wanted to start out by saying, I guess speaking a little bit about Terri and my family. We grew up, there was 5 of us. As I mentioned, there was a younger sister, Suzanne. There was my parents, Bob and Mary Schindler. And then there was Terri. Terri was born first in 1963. And then I followed shortly thereafter, 13 months to be exact. Many of us, I guess, refer to us as Irish twins because of the closeness that we were born. And then Suzanne came along in 1968. As I said, we grew up in the Philadelphia area, just outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And we were very strong, very close family growing up. We were all raised, went through the parochial school system. That included high school. I actually went on to a Catholic college. And we lived very close to many of our family. And during the holidays and And birthdays and those special times, most of the family and friends would converge on our house, and we would celebrate. And really, I remember those times as being very memorable and just a very happy time in my life. Terri met Michael Schiavo in 1983 in college. And believe it or not, it was the first person that Terri ever met who she dated. And I believe within a year's time, or maybe just over a year, they had been engaged and married. And they were married in 1984. That was 1984, and then just 2 years after that, our family relocated to St. Petersburg, Florida. So by 1987, I stayed back for a year, but then by 1987, our entire family was now living in St. Petersburg, Florida. Again, my dad retired, wanted to move to Florida, and we all followed because we were a very, very close family, and we all wanted to be together. It was then in 1990 that Terri collapsed. It was February 25th, 1990. I saw Terri a few hours earlier. She was perfectly fine. We still do not know to this day what caused my sister's collapse. There has been no conclusive findings on what caused Terri to collapse, although our family has our own suspicions. It was in 1990 that our family and Michael Schiavo were working together for the first 2 years to try to provide Terri the help and rehabilitation that we knew she needed because of what had happened. She had lost several minutes of oxygen to the brain, which caused her to suffer this severe brain injury that she had until she passed away. But for the first 2 years, up until 1992, as I said, we all worked together and were working very close to provide the help that Terri needed. Right in the beginning, after Terri collapsed, shortly after, within a few weeks, an attorney friend of Michael's had already put into his mind that he might have a malpractice suit against Terri's treating physicians. And so what happened then, that did happen, and it wasn't until 1992 that Michael actually did sue Terri's 2 doctors in a medical malpractice suit. So we have 2 years up until the trial, the medical malpractice trial started, that our family was working with Michael trying to get help for Terri. The trial started in November of 1992. It lasted for a week. Michael testified in this trial that he loved his wife, Terri, took his vows seriously, recited them, and said that he wanted to care for Terri for the rest of his life. The jury, it was in front of a jury, and Michael and his attorneys were suing Terri's 2 doctors for $20 million. They believed that they needed that money because Terri was could possibly live 30, 40, 50 years. And they sued for $20 million. Now, the jury came back and awarded Terri significantly less. They awarded her $1.5 million that was put into a medical trust fund for Terri's lifelong rehabilitation and therapy. Michael did walk away with $600,000 that he received for loss of consortium, which was separate from the medical malpractice, the medical fund money that Michael was awarded. Now, I tell you all this for a reason, because if you heard in the media, Terri supposedly wanted to die. These were Terri's wishes to die. And that's what was said repeatedly by the media, that Terri wanted to die. I'm telling you this because during the first 2 years, and while Michael was suing the doctors for all that money to take care of Terri for the rest of her life for rehabilitation and therapy, there was never any mention of any wishes that Terri would want to die. Michael never mentioned anything, and they were mentioned by nobody else. And of course, our family never mentioned anything because Terri never said anything about dying if she was ever in such a condition. Nevertheless, Michael was awarded the money, Terri was awarded the money, and it was put into a trust fund for her. Now, I'm just going to give you a short timeline because to get into the complexity of the case would take too long and would bore you while I was explaining it. But I would like to do a short timeline focusing just on these wishes, because I believe that this case was never about Terri's wishes. I believe that this case was about killing Terri because there is a very aggressive, very active, and a very powerful euthanasia movement that's occurring in our country. And when I tell you the timeline of Terri's wishes, I think you'll understand why this whole notion that Terri wanted to die was absolutely ludicrous and absurd. So for the first 2 years, we heard nothing about Terri's wishes. Michael is trying to do everything he can to provide therapy and rehabilitation. The money comes in November of 1992. February of 1993, my father confronts Michael at the nursing home Terri was in and says, Michael, you promised the money that came in for Terri's medical trust was going to be used for her rehabilitation. When is that rehabilitation going to start? This was now 3 months after the money came in and was sitting in Terri's trust fund. Michael became very angry. A fight ensued, and that's when the severing of the relationship occurred between Michael Schiavo and our family. Michael said that he will make all decisions, and we would no longer have any decisions as far as Terri's care or treatment. And that's what happened. In February of 1993, we no longer were able to do anything to help Terri, my parents or myself. Michael was the guardian. He had 100% control over all decisions. That's the way the laws are. The guardian has 100% control over all the care and well-being of whoever the guardian is that they're guardian of. So now keep in mind, November 1992, Michael's telling a jury he needs all this money to take care of Terri for the rest of her life. We have the fight between my parents and Michael in 1993. We're no longer speaking. That's really when the fight to protect my sister's life begins, in February 1993. In the spring of 1993, we find this out after the fact, but Terri develops an infection, a UTI infection. Michael instructs the nursing home not to care for that infection. Terri would have died of sepsis within 7 days. Incidentally, Michael is the inheritor of Terri's trust fund. So if anything would happen to Terri and she would die, he would have inherited close to $1 million at that time. The nursing home said, Michael, we can't do that. There's laws against that. We cannot simply not treat a person. So the nursing home intervened and stopped it from happening. So we have from November of 1992, within just a few months, Michael went from reciting his wedding vows to the jury that he wanted to care for Terri the rest of her life, to he made his first attempt to end Terri's life in 1993. 1994 we're now into 1994. There was never any mention of Terri's wishes. 1995, there was never any mention that Terri wanted to die if she was ever in this condition. Meanwhile, we're still battling Michael to get guardianship back of Terri, which our family is unable to do. We learn in 1995 that Michael now begins to cohabitate with another woman that he met in 1994. Her name is Jody Sanzoni. This is in 1995. Still, there is no mention of Terri's wishes. We learn that Michael in 1995 made his first contact with George Filos. George Filos was Michael's attorney during this fight. George Filos is an expert in euthanasia and this whole right to die philosophy of this death culture, of this death movement. Michael makes contact with this attorney in 1995. Still no mention of Terri's wishes. 1996, still no mention of Terri's wishes. 1997, we learn in an obituary that Michael's mother died. In the obituary, when they print in the obituary, the surviving family members of the person that died, they mention Michael and his fiancée, Jody Sanzoni. Never mentions my sister, who he is still legally married to. So Michael announces in 1997 that he intends to marry Jody Sanzoni, which we're flabbergasted, thank you, because we didn't understand how he was going to do that, still being married to Terri. 1998, we're now into 1998. 8 years after Terri's collapse, we get a letter from Mr. Filos in the mail saying that Michael has petitioned the court to start the process of removing Terri's feeding tube, based on the fact that Michael now has suddenly remembered that Terri would not want to live in this condition. 1999, there's a court that the court appoints a guardian ad litem. The guardian ad litem's responsibility is to investigate the merits of Michael's petition. The guardian ad litem starts in 1999 and conducts a 6-month investigation into the merits of Michael's petition. After 6 months, he comes back and recommends to the court that the feeding tube should not be removed. And basically, it was for 2 reasons. The one reason was that he was extremely troubled and disturbed that Michael waited 8 years before he decided that he remembered that Terri would not want to live in this condition. The guardian ad litem was also very troubled and disturbed that Michael was going to so happily inherit close to $1 million once Terri died. So he felt as though Michael had an enormous conflict of interest in the case and recommended that the feeding tube remain in. Um, the trial was set for January of 2000. Just before the trial began, the judge threw out the guardian ad litem's report. So now we went into the trial, beginning the trial, where they were going to ask a judge, Judge George Greer, to remove Terri's feeding tube based on an alleged wish that Terri made when she was in her early 20s, mind you, that she would not want to live in this condition. The trial started. Michael testified that he heard Terri say that she would not want to live in this condition. Now remember, this is all hearsay evidence, which astonishingly, just a few weeks before the trial started, we learned that not only is Michael going to testify that these were Terri's wishes, we now learn that Michael's brother and Michael's sister-in-law have now suddenly remembered that Terri would not want to live in this condition. They evidently heard it also when Terri was in her early 20s, and it took them close to 10 years before they remembered that Terri would not want to live in this condition. Nevertheless, they testified. On the other end, I testified, my father testified, my mother testified, Terri's closest friend that she grew up in Philadelphia, and Terri's closest friend that she was working with now in Florida. We all testified that it was completely uncharacteristic. Terri never spoke about these end-of-life wishes. She never spoke about death, for that matter. But nevertheless, the judge came back and ruled that Michael's brother and Michael's sister-in-law were credible, that my family and Terri's best friend at work and in Philadelphia were all not credible, and therefore ruled that Terri's feeding tube could be removed. The ruling was made on February 11th, 2000. So that's really just a real quick timeline of just this whole wishes notion and how the judge came to the conclusion that Terri wanted to die. But as I said, you heard it over and over again because they made sure every time they did an interview, Michael and his attorney would make sure that they would say that this is Terri's wish, that this is Terri's wish. And it became one of the hardest fights that we had to fight as a family, trying to tell the people when we were interviewed that this whole wishes thing was absolutely ridiculous, but yet the judge ruled in Michael's favor. So as I said, we never believed this was about wishes, Terri's wishes. We believe this is really just an indication of a very strong euthanasia movement that's occurring in our country right now. I wanted to talk about really how we got to what has happened in the last 10, 15 years, where now we are as a society, are determining when it's okay and not okay to kill somebody based on their so-called quality of life, because I believe that's what happened in my sister's case. I just want you to remember something, though, as I'm speaking about this, because we became very close with the Franciscan brothers in the States. And one day, Brother Anthony said to me that, and it was something that Father had alluded to, speaking here earlier, and that is, he said this, he said, where there is love, there is no burden. Where there is love, there is no burden. And I truly believe that. And what happened to my sister and what's happening to other people, not only in the States, but in our, around the world, is just an absence of love. And we are deciding that people with disabilities and people with brain injuries are an inconvenience, and therefore rationalizing and justifying killing them. But what has really frightened me, the more I learned these past 5 years about what happened to Terri, is how we are paralleling, and when I say we, I'm talking about our society, our culture, our nation, but as I said, many of this is probably what I'm saying, and I don't know exactly what's going on here in England, but I'm hearing that it's not good what's happening with this movement. I know there is one case that I've read about that's currently going through your court system, but what's happening in America is closely paralleling what happened prior to the Holocaust. I'm not talking about the Holocaust, I'm talking about prior to the Holocaust. And I want to explain that and show you the similarities. I get criticized a lot in the States for discussing this, but yet nobody has taken issue with what I'm saying, because what is happening is frightening close, if not the same exact thing that happened, this whole Nazi mentality that occurred not that long ago. And it just amazes me at the apathy of the American people and how they once said something like this would never happen again, and it is happening again in our country every day, every single day. But I want to start out by reading something to you by Pamela Hennessy. And you'll understand it when I read it, and then what I'm going to read afterwards. But Pamela Hennessy is an advocate for people like my sister. And she wrote this. She wrote, "The idea of euthanasia as a method of dealing with severely disabled people is nothing new. In 1939, and under the direction of Philip Bowler and Dr. Karl Brandt, the Third Reich initiated what was known as a T4 euthanasia program, an aggressive campaign to put severely disabled individuals out of their misery. Though this program was disguised by its participants as a merciful end to lives unworthy of life, many important experts and historians believe it to be the precursor to the atrocities of the Holocaust and Hitler's final solution. In a report compiled by Germany's Federal Archive, researchers report that Nazi Germany used hundreds of hospitals and clinics to kill at least 200,000 handicapped, mentally ill, and other institutional patients who were deemed physically inferior." Well, ladies and gentlemen, this type of thing is happening every single day in our country. And although Terri's case made national and international headlines, giving the impression to a lot of people in America that Terri was the first case that this happened, wrong, because this type of thing is happening every single day. And I have proof. George Filos, who I mentioned earlier, Michael Schiavo's attorney, he did an interview in a Florida newspaper while this case was going on. And when he said this, my jaw hit the floor. I read it it was in Lakeland, Florida, an article, an interview that he gave to them. And I was expecting to hear all kind of protests and outrage and different people commenting on this comment. And much to my surprise and disappointment, nobody said a word. But this is what he said. They asked him, why is Terri's case, in your opinion, why is Terri's case making the news that it's making? And Mr. Filos said, I don't know. And he said he don't know because of this. Quote, "This is one isolated case out of tens of thousands over the years." So he admitted, right then, not so nonchalantly and matter-of-factly, that Terri's case is just one out of tens of thousands that's occurring in our country over the years. And this came, I guess, as a shock to nobody, because, as I said, it went with really no protest or outrage that he would say something like that. But I guess it is, and I know that it is, because now we're hearing accounts of this type of thing happening every single day, quietly, under the radar, for a long time. And why is it happening? Well, I think ultimately why it's happening, it comes down to money. I believe, and many other people believe, that as a healthcare system, with all the problems in healthcare in our society, in our country right now, there's certain doctors, there's certain judges, attorneys, that the insurance industry that do not want to pay the money to keep people like my sister alive. They won't come out and say it. At least I didn't think they would until I'll read you something in a second. They won't come out and say it, but I think the underlying issue here is money. And they have been spending an enormous amount of money to pass laws, which they have now passed in our country, that makes it rather easy to go into a courtroom and not even have to go into a courtroom to kill the disabled and kill those that are suffering from disabilities. Our country has, since Roe versus Wade, which was the law that decriminalized abortion, since Roe versus Wade, the pro-life organizations have been working very hard to overturn the abortion laws, and it's something. It's very honorable what they're doing. I'm not disagreeing with it because it has to be done. But unfortunately, what has happened in our country, that there's been such focus placed on abortion that this euthanasia issue has been flying under the radar. And that's why so many of these laws, in fact, every state now, I'm going to mention to them in a second what these two laws are, they have been passed in all our states, and now it's going to be extremely difficult to go back and change the laws back to where they once were. But I'll get into that in a second. But I want to talk about this whole money notion, because I really believe that is the underlying issue with what's going on here. And it may be so true in this country as well. But let me read to you, some of you might have heard of Wesley Smith. Wesley Smith has been warning about us about this euthanasia issue for many years, long before my sister's case made national headlines. And he said this, in fact, I think he was just over here not too long ago, if some of you might have ever heard him. If you ever have a chance to see Wesley speak, or if you're interested in this topic, he has some fabulous books, one being I believe it's called Force Exit, and also The Culture of Death. Great books on this issue. But anyway, he said this. He said, quote, "Imagine a healthcare system in which the profit incentives favor killing as the best treatment for cancer, motor neuron disease, multiple sclerosis, spinal injury, Alzheimer's disease, and the many other medical conditions that eventually impact us all. Imagine the potential for abuse and coercion in a healthcare system in which killing is seen as a way to broaden accessibility to healthcare for others in society." That was Wesley Smith. And then there's Ken Connor. Ken Connor was the attorney that represented Governor Jeb Bush. Governor Jeb Bush intervened in my sister's case and was trying to do what he could to save her life. And he was doing an interview, and Mr. Connor said this. He said, quote, and I think it's very accurate what Mr. Connor said. He said, "We are living in a culture where the sanctity of life ethic is being eroded away, and we begin to look at the net worth of an individual based on the cost-benefit ratio. And if we all live long enough, the day will come when we are old and perhaps infirmed. We are no longer generating an income, but it's a cost to maintain our life in existence." Mr. Connors, he finished by saying, "Florida has many, many people that live in nursing homes. Really, our country does in general. What are the implications for these people going forward into the future? Are we going to respect and protect their lives and treat them as human beings created in God's image? Or are we going to say, well, you know, their quality of life just doesn't measure up, their functional capacity is diminished, and so is their human dignity, out to the garbage with them?" So that's just two quotes that I'd like to read you from Mr. Connor, Wesley Smith, really talking about this whole money issue. I wouldn't have believed it, as I said before. I wouldn't have believed that. I always thought this is something that they would never really speak about this whole equating money to life, where you know, how much. When does it come a point where we stop paying? You hear about it once in a while. They'll make comparisons, but just 2-3 weeks ago, I was on Google. There's always being something written about my sister. I do a Google search on her probably 4 or 5 times a day, and there's always being something written on her. Well, I found something that caused me I was very alarmed and very offended by this article. But it is exactly what I'm just talking about. Let me just read you a couple quotes. This is from Froma Harpip. I don't know how to pronounce it. It's Harrop. And this appeared in many of the papers in our country. And I'm going to talk about our media in a second. But this was the headline. It said, "The Taxpayer's Stake in End-of-Life Decisions." She starts out by saying, I'm not going to read you the whole article, just a few excerpts. "Suppose grandmother has a living will. It says that if she falls into a vegetative state, like Terri Schiavo did, she wants to be kept alive on a feeding tube. She raises the question, well, how long? Until the good Lord takes me away. One terrible day, she is thus stricken, and in goes the feeding tube. Okay, who pays for her care?" She goes on to say, "The time has come for that conversation, and it ought to be frank. Medicaid, the health insurance plan for the poor, is supported by federal and state taxpayers. Medical technology can keep people with no hope of recovery floating between life and death for decades. The taxpayers have a right to set limits on how much of this they will finance." So basically, she's coming right out and saying, we have a right in America as taxpayers that we can say, okay, we're going to spend this much on this person, and then that's it. She goes on to say, "Such situations can cause anguish for families. It's one thing to see that the money used to keep grandmother comfortable in her last years. It's another to spend it on keeping her unconsciously tied to tubes month after month, especially when the family wealth could have been assigned to the children's education. But if grandmother's living will says to keep her breathing no matter what, and there's no long-term care insurance, that's where the money will go. Once her assets are depleted, however, the taxpayers, through Medicaid, take over. But should they? There are arguments aplenty over the enormous sums being devoted to heroic end-of-life treatments, even when the ailing person is conscious." She even makes the argument, even when they're conscious, we're spending too much money on these people, or are we? She goes on, "But the wisdom of using taxpayer dollars to keep people in irreversible comas or vegetative states is less debatable. Should we feel obliged to spend $80,000 or more a year to provide 24-hour nursing for someone who will never wake up? Well, if you ask me, I say yes." Anyway, she ends up by saying, most taxpayers would agree that the answer is no, not me. And if the answer is no, then the time has come to question whether even airtight living wills should be the last word. So she's saying, even if you have a living will that says, I want all my money to be spent, or I want to be kept alive, she's saying, even if you have living wills, that should be, she's raising the question, should that be the last word? Well, that was what she wrote, and if you're interested, you could put in, you can find this on a Google search if you do Terri Schiavo, and probably if you put in her last name, Harrop, if you want to read the whole article. But it's very disturbing. Well, it just so happens that, that someone, after that article came out, a friend of mine, emailed me a poster. And I wish I had the poster here to show you. But I'll describe it to you, and I think you could probably get a pretty good image of the poster. The poster, first, there was a picture of a well-groomed doctor. And in front of the doctor, standing in front of the doctor, and he's in his doctor's smock, is a young man or a young boy, and he's somewhat deformed and disabled. And the doctor has his arms on his shoulders. And then there is printing on the poster. And let me read to you what the printing says. And I think you'll know where it's from as soon as I read you the first line here. Now remember the picture of the doctor and the boy, and try to remember what I just read about the whole equating money to life. And this is what it says. It says 60,000 Reichsmark. This is what this person suffering from hereditary defects cost the community of Germans during his lifetime. Fellow member of the German people, that is your money too. That's what the poster says. Can anyone guess when that poster was being circulated? Yes, what I talked about. It was pre-Holocaust, when doctors were killing disabled and babies based on this whole quality of life mentality, which is what's happening today in our society. Doctors were the first executioners back, what I'm speaking about, back pre-Holocaust, and it seems to me that the doctors are the ones that are doing it today. I want to talk about, how is this occurring in our country? How are we, how is this so-called being allowed to take place? Why are the laws changing? Why are we seeing this happening? I believe on a daily basis, if not worse. But there's something I want to read by. There's a book called "Dehumanizing the Vulnerable" by William Brennan. And personally, until I got into this fight trying to save my sister's life, I had no idea, none whatsoever, the power of our popular media and what they are doing to erode this whole sacredness of life, the sanctity of life. We are now accepting this whole quality of life mentality. We are becoming desensitized to what we are doing. We are becoming desensitized to killing human beings, and we are now in our country looking at something that once was so evil is now being accepted. But let me read something to you what he said, because again, this all fits together. And believe me, ladies and gentlemen, euthanasia is just a byproduct of the abortion issue. These are the same people. It's the same language in the media. The comparisons, I can draw the comparisons between the abortion issue and the euthanasia issue. It's the same exact thing. I think one of the scariest, I use scary and frightened a lot, but one of the most frightening things, a statistic I heard just the other day, and I had no idea that this statistic ever existed, but I believe, and again, it goes this whole where there's love, there is no burden, but I think it really speaks both to the abortion issue and the disability issue. And that is that, and I could be wrong, but it was either 8 or 9 babies that are known to have Down syndrome are being aborted. So I see, as I said, we don't want to deal with those that are disabled anymore. But let me read to you, back to the media, let me read to you this by William Brennan. He said, quote, "The successful waging of semantic warfare does not rely solely on the sheer number of epithets conjured up, but frequently on the extent of their usage. A few key designations of denigration, continually intoned like any persistent slogan, are apt to have a significant impact. This is in line with the psychology of the big lie so tenaciously advanced by Adolf Hitler in Mein Kampf. If the lies are repeated often enough, they will be embraced. Those who control language control thought, and eventually semantic corruption leads to the alteration of thought itself." I pronounced that wrong. But that's what's happening in our country. And I just want to give you a few of the things that the media is omitting in my sister's case, and why so many Americans think what happened to my sister was perfectly okay. But one of the things was this became a pro-life issue only. If you read the media accounts, our family was supported by the religious right, by the pro-life organizations. We're radicals. All this pro-life. And it's done for one reason. That is done because there are so many in our country that as soon as they hear something is pro-life, they pass judgment right away. And they won't even get involved in the case. They said, oh, these are these crazy pro-lifers. And again, right away, you get labeled in a way that the media wants to label you as these pro-life religious nuts. But what the media never reported, and what was so prevalent in my sister's case, was the support of the disability community. This was not just it was certainly, I'm not saying this wasn't a pro-life issue. It was a pro-life issue. And our family is pro-life, and we supported the pro-life organizations that were speaking out and helping us. But there are a far number of disability organizations that outnumbered the pro-life organizations that were involved. The media rarely, if ever, reported the disability organizations, the local and national disability organizations that were standing shoulder to shoulder with my family. And that is because it came down to language again. That was one reason, not the only reason, but that was language. They did not want to identify Terri as a disabled woman because we don't kill people that are disabled, but we can kill somebody that's vegetative, that's in a vegetable, which is how the media wanted to portray her as. But let me read to you something. You probably didn't know this. There was, just prior to my sister's death, and months before that, there was 25 national and local disability organizations that were speaking out on behalf of my sister and my family, saying that the feeding tube should not be removed. And they have been, again, like Wesley Smith and others, the disability organization has been screaming about this issue for many years before Terri's case ever made headlines. And the reason that they are so frightened is because of this. Families that, like my parents, that want to care for someone that's disabled, someone that can't speak for themselves, what happens to their, say it's their child, what happens to their child when they die and when the parents die? The disability community, one of the reasons they're so frightened about this is because if parents are taking care of someone that's disabled or profoundly brain injured like my sister, and then the parents die and there's no one to take care of them that's a family member, they would become most likely wards of the state. And once they become wards of the state, then we get into the whole money issue and all the other issues that they would want to use to terminate this person's life. And that's one of the reasons the disability community is so frightened by what's happening in our country. But this is from Diane Coleman. She's president of Not Dead Yet, which is a national disability organization in America. And she said this, quote, "You've been hearing for a long time that the only opposition in this case is coming from the religious right. But a dozen national disability groups filed friend of the court briefs in the state and federal proceedings, and in the last month, 25 national disability rights groups have adopted a statement in favor of feeding Terri Schiavo. The Schiavo case should be seen as a wake-up call for all of us." Again, the press would omit that from the reports, and they would constantly talk about our family being supported by the pro-life organizations. The polls were ridiculous. The polls were used and worded in a way to get people to support what Michael Schiavo was doing, and it was working. They were completely slanted. There were polls that were released that reflected the situation much more accurately, and when they did, there was quite a different result. For instance, there was a Zogby poll. You might have heard of Zogby. It's an international poll type organization. They asked this question. Again, this poll is rarely, if ever, reported in the mainstream media because it did not come out with the results that the mainstream media wanted to hear. But this was the question they asked Americans. If a disabled person is not terminally ill, not in a coma, and not being kept alive on life support, and they have no written directive, should or should they not be denied food and water? Now that's about as accurate and reflective of Terri's situation as you can get in just one sentence. What do you think the poll result was? How many people do you think supported not removing removing Terri's feeding tube? Well, 79% of the people said you should not remove Terri's feeding tube. Yet, again and again, you heard about these horrible generalized polls where the American people were favoring removing Terri's feeding tube. There are just some of the examples that I wanted to give today. I could go through and give you a litany. The autopsy report. The autopsy report was egregious in the way the press reported that. In fact, I am going to talk about that for a moment. Let me spend just 2 seconds on the autopsy report, because you heard about how Terri confirmed that she was in a PVS condition. You heard this and that she was never going to get better, and so on and so forth. They wanted to justify and rationalize what Michael Schiavo did, and it worked, because the media it went to a feeding frenzy mode when the autopsy report came out, and it got so bad that we were getting media outlets that were asking our family to apologize to Michael Schiavo for what we put him through for the 5 years. I'm not kidding you, and I'll mention something else that happened in a second. But what the autopsy report didn't report was this. They said that Terri was in a PVS. That was completely false. And I urge people to go read the autopsy report. It's on our website. If you read it, you'll see this. Never reported by the media. One thing was the medical examiner who conducted the autopsy report said that, and he went out of his way to make this point clear. He said that he could not determine if Terri was in a persistent vegetative state, because that can only be made from a person that's alive. It cannot be done post-mortem. They also said that the medical examiner, the doctor that accompanied the medical examiner, Dr. Stephen Nelson, who was a neuropathologist, he even went on record as saying that he could not conclude whether Terri might have been even in a minimally conscious state, which is a higher level of brain function than a PVS state. So that was never reported in the media. And I can go through and tell you other things about the autopsy report that wasn't reported in the media. But aside from that, and one thing I want to make perfectly clear, aside from the autopsy report and what the media said, and even my sister was what they were saying about her, even if she was in a PVS, which our family doesn't believe she was, we didn't care. It didn't matter to our family. We loved her the way she was, whether she was going to get better or not. Something else the press never heard us saying. We just wanted to take Terri home and care for her. That was our only intention. And what scared me so much about this autopsy report and how they just went crazy over Terri having this profound brain injury and she was irreversible and couldn't get better. Does the media realize, and I'm sure they do, how many persons out there have just as much brain injury, even worse than Terri? It seems to me that we're justifying by this autopsy report saying, okay, if a person reaches a certain level of disability, a certain level of brain injury, it's perfectly okay to kill them. It's perfect, we can rationalize and justify killing these people because they're not like us. They're different. Ladies and gentlemen, there is such an extreme prejudice that's occurring against disabled people and people with brain injuries in our country. And this is where this prejudice is taking us. We are now making decisions on when to end your life. Father Pavone, who I'm sure many of you know in this room, he was so upset by the autopsy report that he issued a statement that I want to read to you real quick. And I don't think I could have said it best myself, because this really wraps it up in a nutshell. I wish I had 1/10 of the gift that Father Pavone has of when he speaks, because he's so eloquent and so powerful at the same time. But Father Pavone said this. He said, "The autopsy goes on to say that Terri's brain was profoundly atrophied and only half the normal size. Fine. If that's what the experts tell us, there is no problem believing them. But what does that mean? That she was only half human, only half a person? Or that she only had half the rights that the rest of us have? That is the conclusion that we must never accept. That is a conclusion that does not come from an autopsy, but a callous disregard for human life. Terri did not die from atrophy of the brain. She died from atrophy of compassion. Too many people, starting with Michael Schiavo, were unwilling to accept the fact that profoundly injured people require profound compassion and care. Even if this autopsy report showed that Terri was 10 times more damaged than she was, our moral obligation to respect and protect her life would not change at all. We do not have to pass a test to qualify for our human rights. An autopsy is a measure of physical damage, not of human rights." And that was Father Pavone. But again, the press continues to this day to dehumanize my sister, to somehow describe her as a non-person. They use the word vegetative constantly over and over again. Again, it's a ploy to dehumanize Terri, to take away her personhood. There are doctors that are issuing in medical journals this whole personhood theory, where they believe that there does come a point where a person no longer contains personhood and becomes something else. I don't know what that is, but they do. There's a gentleman by the name of, I shouldn't even call him a gentleman, Peter Singer. Many of you may have heard of him. He believes that a baby doesn't reach personhood, I believe, till it's 1 year old. So a parent has the right, he believes, and I believe this is accurate what I'm saying. He believes that you can, up to a year that a child is born, it's perfectly okay to kill that baby because they haven't achieved personhood until about a year when they become conscious of who they are. So there's all kind of this type of philosophy or mentality that's occurring in our country. And Peter Singer teaches or is a professor at Princeton University, which is one of the most highly acclaimed universities in our country. But if you don't think I'm kidding about the media, I'm going to give you two examples. One, Michael Schiavo. Last year, every year, Michael Schiavo was the guardian. In Florida, we have what they call a Guardianship Association Award. It's given to the. It's given every year. It's given to the guardian who displays courage, and so on and so forth. Last year, Michael Schiavo received the Florida Guardianship Association Award because they felt they decided to bestow the honor on Michael Schiavo because of his commitment to honoring what he claimed was his wife's wish not to be kept alive artificially. So Michael's receiving awards. Judge Greer, in this case, has probably received a half a dozen awards for his courage in ruling that my sister should die. So again, ladies and gentlemen, we are seeing a real problem occurring in our country. And if you don't think the media is influencing what's going on, I'll give you one example. I don't know how much you follow the movies, but in America, not this past year, but the year before, I believe in 2005, 2004, I'm sorry, there was a movie called $1 Million Baby. I don't know if any of you heard of it. $1 Million Baby was really glorifying assisted suicide, where a young lady became a quadriplegic and said that she wanted to die, and Clint Eastwood did. He killed her. He played her friend in this movie. And he killed her, and the movie was glorifying, like he did the right thing by killing this young woman. And that won, I believe it got, I don't know how many Academy Awards it won several, but it was nominated, I believe, for 8 or 9 Academy Awards. The Passion of the Christ, which I'm sure you all have heard of, was virtually ignored by the Academy. I think it got 1 nomination for photography, but I don't even think it was mentioned during the Academy Awards at all. So we see what's happening in our country, and how the media is having a real effect on the people of our country. I just wanted to say, it's not only the media, and unfortunately, the leaders of our Catholic Church are not helping our matters at all. Locally, our bishop did little to nothing to help my sister, our family. Let me say this before I talk about the Catholic Church. We had a tremendous amount of support from many wonderful priests in the Catholic Church, but it wasn't enough. We had little to no support from the bishops in our country. For example, well, let me first say, you probably don't know this, but we had a Catholic priest that testified on Michael's behalf at the original trial in January 2000, and the Catholic priest said that it's within Catholic church teaching to remove my sister's feeding tube, which it wasn't. The priest did not speak to anybody in our family, did not speak to my mom, my dad, didn't speak to me or my sister, didn't speak to our attorney. The only person he spoke to was Michael Schiavo and his attorney, yet he came in and testified. I don't even know if the priest knew that my sister was a devout Catholic, a practicing Catholic, pro-life, and I don't even know if he knew that Michael had been cohabitating with another 5 years at the time that the priest testified that it was okay to remove her feeding tube. But nevertheless, he did. But since that time, as I said, we got little to no support from our local Catholic leaders and really the bishops nationally. It wasn't until, thank God, that the Vatican started to speak out loudly on this case that we started to get some activity from some of the bishops in America. Our family sent out over 200 letters in November of 2004. We sent them to every bishop in our country, asking them to speak publicly out about Terri in support of her life. And we got, I believe, 5 responses back, and only 2 of them, 2 bishops agreed to speak out publicly on Terri's behalf. So I only say this, ladies and gentlemen, because this euthanasia movement is moving forward aggressively, and the church, as we all know, can be a very powerful influence for good in our country and good in this world. And our leaders in the Catholic Church need to do more, at least in the United States, on speaking out on this horrible attack on human life. So there was, I want to read to you, I'm going to finish up by reading to you, what better way to finish but by reading to you about the Pope. But first I just wanted to talk really about who I believe are the heroes that are the heroes in this case, not in this case, but the heroes out there as far as the disabled community, as far as these people with brain injury. Because there is a very, as I said over and over again, there's a very aggressive attack on what's happening in our country. And not enough is said about the people that are caring for people like my sister. I'll never forget the time that I went in and sat down with our attorney, and she looked at me and she said, you know, Bobby, if we win this case and something happens to your parents, it's going to be you that's going to be taking care of your sister. And you know, it was the first time I really thought about it, that I'd be dedicating my life to caring for my sister 24 hours, 7 days a week. But you know, I never flinched for a second, because, I mean, frankly, what other choice do we have? What other choice do we have other than caring and loving these people and showing them compassion? Well, we have another choice, and that's to kill them, which is happening in our country. I got the question over and over again, come on, Bobby, would you want to live in this condition? Any person in the right mind would not want to live in this condition. And I said, well, of course, nobody would choose to live as a disabled person. We all had the choice. But where is this leap occurring that's occurring in our country from, I would not want to live in this condition, to, okay, let's do everything we can to kill them? And that's what's happening in our country. We are taking this leap from not wanting to live in this condition to killing people because it's either inconvenience to us, or I think a lot of times it scares people to look at the disabled community. It faces them with their own mortality. But without people like my sister, without people that have profound brain injury and that are disabled, how else can we show compassion? How much can we show love other than caring for these people? And it's just astonishing to me, just the apathy and how quick we come to conclusion that and rationalize that it's perfectly okay to terminate persons with disabilities. Every reason that Michael Schiavo, every reason that his attorney, every reason that these death proponents give us and try to rationalize to us that it's okay to kill these people is every reason why we should be caring for them and loving them. Every single reason. But yet they have somehow flipped it on us. And now in our society, we are accepting this as a compassionate thing to do and a loving thing to do. Let me, someone please explain to me how there is compassion into walking into a room for almost 2 weeks and watching your sister and my parents having to watch their child slowly starve and dehydrate to death. It is an image that will be seared in my memory forever, and my parents. And it rips my heart out knowing that my parents have to live with this the rest of their life when all they wanted to do was care and love their child, and yet they were told no by a court system and by a husband that looked at Terri as being an inconvenience. One thing that bothered me so much, do you all know who Christopher Reeves is? He was a quadriplegic, and his wife, Dana, I believe Dana Reeves, who just died recently. Dana Reeves, God bless her, dedicated her life to caring for her husband in this state that he was in. And I believe I read somewhere where Christopher Reeves wanted to die when he first fell victim to this accident. And I believe it was his wife, and I could be wrong, but I believe it was his wife that talked him out of it. And look at the good he did in his years following that, speaking out and trying to help those with spinal injuries. But yet Dana Reeves passed away a few weeks ago, a couple months ago. And the popular media were writing these articles on what a heroine she was for dedicating her life. And they were commending her for dedicating her life to loving and caring to Christopher Reeves that needed all this love, dedication, and compassion. And I thought that, I'm not disagreeing with that. I agreed. And I agree with all the parents and everybody who have dedicated their lives to caring for the disabled and the profoundly brain injured. But I thought to myself, I became completely, how do I say it? I was upset because my parents were vilified in the same media for wanting to do the same exact thing. They were called selfish. They were called all the kinds of words because they wanted to dedicate their life to taking care of my sister for the rest of her life. So I want to just close. First, I just want to say thank you so much. I'm always very humbled by being asked to speak at different organizations and different places, and how thankful I am for you taking the time to come listen to me today. As I said earlier, I'm not much of a public speaker, but I just well, thank you. I just feel it's the truth, and our family needs to keep fighting this fight that's occurring in our country. Our fight with Michael Schiavo essentially is over, and our family created a foundation in the name of my sister Terri Schiavo to continue this fight, this much larger issue that's occurring in our country, and we'll do whatever we can to keep fighting against this powerful movement. If you're interested, our website is Terry's Fight, TerrisFight.org. If you do use Google, or if you do a pro-life search, if you put in Terri Schiavo, it'll be the first foundation it's listed. I urge you all to continue, if you be so kind, to stay in touch with our website. You can email us on that website, and it'll tell us what we're doing, what our foundation is doing. We have some real, I believe, some goals that are going to only going to do more to help to protect the disabled and from what's happening in our country. But please visit our website. Our family did just write a book. One of the reasons we wrote a book. Oh, thank you. That was good timing. It's called A Life That Matters. It's written by our whole family, and we wrote this book for really two reasons. One is because so much that was misreported and not reported by the media, some of the things that I told you today, really just to talk about our family's battle and what we had to go through just to care for Terri these past 15 years. It's astonishing what we had to go through to fight a court system in this movement just to care for my sister. And also we talk about, again, a lot of it what I spoke today, and really something I didn't speak to today, but maybe, I don't know if you'll address it, maybe, I'm sorry, Paul speaking next, I don't know, but advanced directives. I don't know what the laws are here concerning advanced directives, but the language is so very important, understanding the language in advanced directives. We talk a lot about in our book on the dangers of advanced directives. After my sister's case, everybody went out and wanted to get living wills out of fear. And I guess, advanced directives are a good thing, but you really need to understand the language in advanced directives. So that's really the reason we bought a book. I don't believe it's being sold here in the bookstores, but you can go online, you can go to Amazon or to Barnes & Noble, or you can go to our website and also purchase the book through our website if you are interested. We would really appreciate your support. All the money does go into our foundation to again, fight against what's happening. And I just want to close on one last thing, and that's Pope John Paul II. Pope John Paul II, again, I don't know how much you followed the case, but there was quite a union between Pope Paul and my sister. The very day, my sister's death occurred during the Lenten season, during Easter season. She died just 5 days after Easter. And the Pope became gravely ill during the same time. In fact, the day that the Pope died, the day that Terri died, the Pope was put on a feeding tube. And I think the coincidences were not to ignore what was happening between the Pope and Terri. But one of the things that astounds me that with the support we had the support from the Florida legislatures, we had support from the governor of Florida, we had support from Congress, we had support from President Bush, we had support from the Vatican, all trying to do. We had support from Mel Gibson, for crying out loud. He actually put out a statement trying to support my, trying to convince them to give support back to my parents. In fact, funny story was when I was, I called my dad one time. I was calling my dad, And we have 2 lines at our house, and my mom answered the phone, and she's like, shh. She's like, shh, shh. I'm like, shh, who's going to hear me on the phone, Mom? And she said, you got to be quiet. Your father's, you'll never guess who your dad's on the phone with right now. And I couldn't imagine who. I said, who's she on the phone with? And she said, Mel Gibson's on the phone with your dad right now. So I'm like, tell him to hold on. I'm going to drive right over. But that's when it became somewhat surreal when you hear that Mel Gibson has called our family to offer his support. But yet he did. But the reason I'm saying this, with all the support that we got, and from so many of the cardinals in the Vatican, even the Pope, we still were unsuccessful in saving Terri's life. Father Pavone actually told us a story that he knows people at the Vatican, and evidently the day Terri died, they had told the Pope the day that Terri died, and he just died. He died 2 days later. So knowing that your sister was able to reach the Pope's ears is something I'll probably never really fully process in my brain. But it does make me feel somewhat comforting that I know that Terri's up in heaven with the Pope right now. But I just want to read what the Pope says, because I think it's beautiful what the Pope said. The Pope would like particularly to underline how the administration of food and water, even when provided by our artificial means, always represents a natural means of preserving life, not a medical act. Its use, furthermore, should be considered in principle ordinary and proportionate, and as such morally obligatory, insofar as and until it is seen to have attained its proper finality, which in the present case consists in providing nourishment to the patient and alleviation of his suffering. He went on to say this: in opposition to such trends of thought, I feel the duty to reaffirm strongly that the intrinsic value and personal dignity of every human being do not change no matter what the concrete circumstances of his or her life. A man, even if seriously ill or disabled in the exercise of his highest functions, is and always will be a man and will never become a vegetable or an animal. And then I want to close by this last thing, because I think it's absolutely beautiful. Even our brothers and sisters who find themselves in the clinical condition of a vegetative state retain their human dignity in all its fullness. The loving gaze of God the Father continues to fall upon them, acknowledging them as his sons and daughters, especially in need of help. So thank you very much. I appreciate you coming to see.